Newgate Prison. As soon as we arrived at the black stern gates of the prison, Widow Susan told me to pull my hood over my head to hide my face and hair. She led me in past the guard, saying she had to visit someone she used to work for. A kind man, with money. She nodded knowingly at the guard. He'll be over on the master's side, probably. What you got for me then, sweetheart? Spit sprayed out between his snaggly black teeth as he laughed down at her. Good ale. She handed him one of the jugs. I made it myself. Now you're a woman who speaks good sense. The guard slurped back the contents of the jug in one go, belched and waved us through. Master's side is for the lucky ones, Widow Susan hissed at me. Those who've got money to give these drunken goats their simple pleasures. We went past the guard into a gloomy hall. It was impossible to tell how big it was so dark. The whole place stank worse than the river, and it was hot and sweaty with so many people jostled together, crying and screaming, some of them, or just crouching, still and silent on the end of chains, like dogs waiting to die. They'd had their legs or their backs broken on the rack, Widow Susan told me. I never thought any place on earth could be as bad as this. I just stood there, stifled and scared, peering out of my hood into that awful darkness, till she jerked my arm. Do you see him? She muttered. Can't stand here gawping. There's a gallery for that sort of entertainment, but you have to pay. She pointed up to a balcony where people were strolling, pointing and laughing at what they could see. I'm not staying here a moment longer than I have to, I tell you. She took the bottle of peppermint water from her basket and breathed it in, splashing it on her forehead. I'm in hell and I ain't even dead yet. I looked around anxiously. There were so many people here and it was so dark. How on earth could I find him? And maybe he wasn't here anyway. Maybe he wasn't one of the lucky ones after all. I shook my head. He isn't here. Then they've hanged him already, and that's a mercy. Come on, we're leaving. It was then that I saw my father. He was half naked and his skin was stripped with blood. He was half naked and his skin was striped with blood. He was standing chained by his wrists and his ankles to a post, so he couldn't sit or lie down or even kneel. His head was bowed and his eyes were closed, and he was swaying as much as his chains would let him. His lips were mumbling. I knew he was praying. I couldn't bear to see him like that. I wanted to rush over to him and put my arms around him, to scream at someone to untie his chains. My father! My father! My hand was trembling as I touched Widow Susan's arm. He's there, I whispered, low with fear and dread. She nodded. Stay here. Don't come any closer. It'll do you no good, nor him neither. So I did as I was told, but I was still nearly fainting with shock. How could they do this to him, my strong, tall father? But I had to do what old Susan had told me, or it might be worse for him, much worse. Nick's family knew far more about how to stay alive than I did. I pulled my hood right round my face, leaving just enough of a gap so I could watch her. A keeper was sitting nearby, bleary-eyed with ale, cursing the prisoners for screaming so loud that they gave him a headache, and Widow Susan hunkered down next to him, and they chatted and laughed for so long that I thought she might have tricked me, and had just come to enjoy the sights of the jail after all. She pointed to one of the groaning prisoners, and they both cackled like a pair of old geese. Then she took the second bottle of ale out of her basket and gave it to him. He took a swig from it, and then put his arm around her and started nuzzling into her neck with his thick, slimy lips. I wanted to scream and drag her away. I wanted to slap her grinning face. All this time my father swayed on his chains and muttered soundlessly, as if only part of him that was alive was his mouth. I felt all my hopes, all my world slipping away from me then. At last the keeper slithered sideways, fast asleep and adding his snores to other noises. Widow Susan stood up at once and went over to my father. She took out one of the phials of oil and began rubbing it gently, so gently into his skin where he'd been bleeding. He winced in sharp pain and opened his eyes. She put a bottle to his lips and told him to sip from it. He drank slowly, and I could tell from where I was standing that the look of agony was clearing from his eyes. He could hold his head up. He could focus on her. She talked to him all the time, though I couldn't hear what she was saying. And from time to time he nodded, but still he clenched his face against the pain when she used more oils on him. I couldn't bear it any longer. I pushed my way outside and stood gasping in the cold air. It was raining. I flung back my hood, letting the rain wash over me, wash away the stench and the horrors of the hell that was my father was in. My tears were streaming down my face, mingling salty and hot with the raindrops. Horses splashed mud at me as they trotted past. Beggars jostled at my side, but I never moved from the spot until Widow Susan came and shook my arm. You've seen how bad he is, she said, so don't hope far too much. I've done what I can. I've done what I can for him. He's easier now, and he'll sleep well for a bit, even standing up like that. I wiped my face with my sleeve. What did you say to him? I told him you'd sent me, and that you were safe. That cheered him up more than any medicine, William. He kept saying, William. Did he really? Did he really say my name? He did, and he thanked me deeply, deeply for the care I've shown him. He is a true gentleman, your father. I thank you deeply too, I said. In that moment, I knew she was greater than any of the ladies I'd met in court, in spite of her rough ways. Will he live? I asked, my voice no more than a husky whisper. He might, till they hang him. The long journey. On the way back to the cottage, we saw Nick whistling cheerfully as he pushed his empty handcart. Have you made any money? The grandmother shouted. Nick opened his hand and showed her a fistful of warm brown coins. She picked out half and closed up his fist again. I'll take the cart back home, she told him. William's as well as he's going to get for a bit, and there'll be no peace for him now if he languishes in our cottage another night. I've been reading the stars, and they tell me now is as good a time as any, for journeying south. Be off with you both. And without any goodbye or other blessing, she took up the shafts of the handcart and heaved it away along the muddy, sticky lane. Have you found out how we get to Dover? I asked. Nick's grandman was right. I'd have gone there on my own if I knew the way, whatever the danger. I wouldn't stay a minute longer in London. He grinned. Well, I know the road sign that points to Dover. I know there's always people coming and going down that road, carts and merchants and the like. The first bit of the Pilgrim's Way to Canterbury. So it'll be clear enough road to follow. And I know the sea's at the end of it. We got this bit of money Grandmam gave us. We could buy some bread and cheese with it to keep us going. I know we'll have to walk slow because you've got no speed in your legs yet. And that's it, he shrugged. That's all I know, Master Will. But how far is it? Miles, he grinned again, as if the prospect of walking miles was something to be cheerful about. But then, Nick was nearly always cheerful. So we'd better get moving. He strode ahead, whistling. We have to go past the Lord Crazy's place again in Greenwich. We might as well have carried on from there in the first place and saved you a mugging and me a few days' work. So we might, I said, but I wouldn't have seen my father. I wouldn't know that he was still alive, and we wouldn't have had any money at all if you hadn't worked. I was already feeling more cheerful. I hurried beside Nick, matching my stride to his, and even trying to whistle with him, though I wasn't much good at hurrying, and whistling at the same time, and it gave me hiccups. We passed Greenwich without stopping, and I was glad of that. I didn't want to risk seeing any more nobles. We spent the night in the woods, and the creepy nights they were too for me. Rooks croaked into the stillness, and deer plunged through the thickets, scaring me out of my wits. Nick snored beside me, and when I fell asleep at last, screech owls like banshees tore my dreams in half. Nick snored on, hearing nothing. On the second morning we saw a hangman's gibbet through the trees, which I was very glad I hadn't seen the night before, and the grey stones of a castle. We met an old woodman with a face as brown as tanned leather, and he told us we were outside the town of Rochester and well on the way to Canterbury, which was halfway to Dover. There was a time, he said, leaning on his axe as if he had a whole day to spare, when this way would have been full of Canterbury pilgrims, on their horses and donkeys, or walking barefoot, some of them. It was a sight to see and a sound to hear. They'd be singing and playing instruments, folks from all over the place, and here with their tales to tell. Hideous strange some of them were too. I miss the pilgrims. Why don't they still come? Nick asked, and the woodman's old face creased up with surprise. You don't know? Do you know why they came in the first place? To worship at Thomas Becket's shrine, I said, not wanting him to think that I was as ignorant as Nick. Aye, the blessed saint lay there for 400 years, till our own good King Henry had his bones dug up and thrown into the Thames. No pilgrims since then. No pilgrims for 2 years or more, and this lane is quiet now without them. Our king had his reasons, no doubt. He swung his axe and smashed it so viciously into the side of a dying oak tree that I jumped away from him in fright. We tramped on and on. Nick tried singing, though his voice wasn't getting any better. Now the lane got busier, with carts piled with heavy loads of vegetables and fruit on the way to the market. One of the carts lost some apples as it bumped along over deep ruts, and we stuffed our stomachs and then our pockets with them. We spent the next night in a barn, and a farmer's wife gave us some small ale to drink and a fistful each of beef to eat, and in exchange we broke some logs into kindling for her. Nick showed me how to do it, and this time I was glad to help him. Next day there was more traffic, all heading for Dover, all piled with goods. The carters called out to us cheerily as they passed us, and we walked and ran in turns. But by the end of the afternoon my boots were giving me blisters, and even Nick had lost the will to hurry. We trudged along, not whistling, not talking. Dusk was falling, the traffic was easing off. We heard a cart rumbling behind us, and Nick turned round and waved his arms at the driver. "We're weary travellers," he called. "May we ride with you for a bit, sir? We're heading to Dover." The carter jerked the reins. His old horse stopped lazily. "Do you have money?" the man grumbled. A little," Nick said carefully. "Then I advise you to walk 3 more miles, where there's a tavern. You'll find many a merchant or carter willing to carry you to Dover from there." "Can we spend 3 miles in your cart?" Nick asked. "Aye, if you must, but you won't thank me for it." "We must," I said. The carter clicked to his horse to set off again, and Nick used up the last of his strength to vault into the cart as it drew past. He heaved me up, and I tumbled in after him, yelping as I landed on something soft and squishy and reeking to high heaven. "Phaw! It's a dung cart!" Nick shouted. He tried to leap out again, but the driver pretended to be deaf and urged his horse on to a fast trot, which set us rolling round and round in the muck, laughing helplessly. He set us down at the tavern, and there, in a cluttered yard, a huge carter built like a bull was unloading stuff. It was nearly dark by then, and although the man held up a lantern when he saw us, I don't think he realised how mucky we were. "We're heading for Dover, sir," Nick called. "Can we take a ride with you? We've got a few pence, but not much." "I'll take you on." His voice seemed to come from somewhere in his belly. "I've some goods to unload here, and you can help me with that. And tomorrow I'm riding empty to Dover, so I'll be glad of your company." That night the man slept in the tavern, and we rolled up in his empty cart, after he'd sent a toothy girl out to us, with a bowl of fish stew and ale. She sniffed as she handed the food to us. "What a stink!" she said, giggling. When the carter came out in the morning, he chased us off to the well to wash ourselves clean. "Clothes and all," he shouted. His voice boomed round the yard. "They'll dry on the back of the cart, and you can wrap yourselves in these blankets till they do." "We thought you hadn't noticed," Nick grinned. "Took me a while," the carter said. "I'm used to smells. When I come up from Dover, I'm usually carrying fish, so there's always a bit of a reek in my cart." But you two last night, it was enough to turn the stomach of a pig. The water was clinking with ice, but I pulled off my tunic and hose and scrubbed myself down. As I was rubbing myself dry with a rough old blanket, I noticed that Nick was trying to keep himself covered up while he washed. "Go on, Nick," I laughed and gave him a shove towards the pail of water, and it was then that I saw what he was hiding. There was a cord looped around his neck, and dangling from that it was a ring. I didn't know what to say. Had Nick stolen the ring from me? No, it was a man. I remembered his stubbly face clearly. But was he something to do with Nick? But if he was, why was Nick travelling with me to Dover? I turned away, baffled and worried. Before I could say anything, the cart driver called me over and gave me some breakfast gruel and asked me to clean out his cart for him. There were the spines and bones and goggle-eyed heads of old fish stuck to the boards. I peeled them out as well as I could, and when Nick ran up to join us, raw-cheeked from the icy water, we spread our clothes out to dry over the back of the cart. We set off, huddled up in our blankets. Nick was sparky, full of chatter and jokes, and he and the driver gossiped away as if they'd known each other for years. The driver told him about 2 big ships that were moored just outside Dover, which were being loaded up with all kinds of things. Special things that rich folks have, he said. "Who owns them?" Nick asked, but the driver shook his head. "No idea, but they're big, they're important. They're bound for Calais, that's all I know." "Calais," Nick said. "That's where we're going, isn't it, Will?" I turned away from him. I didn't want to talk to him. I didn't want to look at him. I had to think about that ring. But at long last, we could hear the screeching laughter of gulls. We could smell the salty tang of the sea. We could hear the fussy noise of people and carts in the town below us. We must be there. I kneeled up in the cart, peering round eagerly. "I'll leave you here," the driver rumbled. "I've a family I like to stay with when I'm here, and there'll be a tasty fish pie for me. Here, you might as well take this." He threw me a dead rabbit, still in its fur. "They gave me this at the tavern, but it's no use to me. I only eat fish, breakfast, noon and supper. Lovely fish." We wriggled back into our still damp clothes and shimmied out of the cart. Nick skipped round and round, waving his skinny arms in the air and yelling, "It's over! It's over! We've come to Dover!" Then he grabbed my arm and whirled round with him, singing out loud. I couldn't help it. Dover! The Ring. We ran to the brow of the hill. The bells were chiming out 3 of the clock. Down below us the little town was bustling with life. We could hear the trundling of cartwheels over cobbles and the shouts of workers calling to each other. Dogs were sending up a frenzy of barking as if they could smell strangers in the town. People were milling everywhere, soldiers, merchants, traders with baskets on their heads and hips. We could see the harbour bristling with dozens of masts. Just beyond the harbour lay 2 huge, brightly painted warships. My spirits rose as high as a skylark. "They'll be the ones the carter told us about, going to Calais." "Can you see Calais from here? Can you see France?" He screwed up his eyes. However hard we scanned the horizon, we couldn't make out anything that looked like another country. But it didn't matter. It was there, we knew it. "Is Mistress Marjorie's husband a Frenchman?" "No," I said. "He's Richard Oakland, the Duke of Carlisle." I felt proud saying that. "But why does he live in France?" "Because he's the lieutenant of King Henry's castle in Calais. It's an English town, but it's in France. We won it hundreds of years ago in a battle." "Right then," said Nick. I probably knew, but I'd forgotten. "I'll go and find us a passage, Master Will, on one of those big sailing ships." He set off at a run, turned round to grin at me, threw his hat in the air, did a somersault and ran off. I remembered the ring again, looped around his neck just like mine had been. "Nick," I shouted, "wait!" I started to run after him and stopped. There was no chasing Nick. He ran as swift as a hound. I was filled with that wriggling doubt again, squirming in my head like ants swarming from a leaf pile. Why was he wearing my ring round his neck? What if he was planning to sell it, to show it to a soldier? I was lonely again, lost and lonely and worried. If I never saw Nick again, I had no idea what I would do. Slowly I collected together some wood and built up a fire. I set about skinning the rabbit the carter had given me, nicking the fur and peeling it away from the tight little body. Then I skewered it with a stick and built a frame to balance it over the flames. Soon its juices were spitting and the familiar smell of roasting meat made my stomach rumble. I thought about Matthew and how we loved to spend a day riding and hunting, and how Ned Porritt would make us a fire and skin and cook a rabbit or hare for us, just like this. We would sit as close to the crackling fire as we could, so our eyes were smarting with the wood smoke, and our hands and faces were scorching hot, and then Matthew and Ned would tease me with stories of headless knights who haunted the dark forests. At last I heard Nick whistling. I jumped up from the fire and ran to meet him. His cheeks were bunched with smiles, and I knew he was in luck, and that he'd found a way of getting us to France. But never, never would I have guessed how we were to do it. "The carter was right," he said. "Those 2 ships are setting off with the tide at first light tomorrow, and we'll be in one of them. The Lion, it's called. We're going as ship's boys, and there'll be plenty for us to do, because each deck will be packed with people. You don't have to worry, just keep your head covered, just do the loading and carrying you're told to do, and no one will even look at you." I gazed at the ships. They were very fine. I could tell even from here. They crouched on the water like hunting animals, with guns shining in the setting sun, and the tall masts draped with coloured banners that were just waiting for the wind to set them streaming. They were no ordinary sailing ships. They were surely ships of war. "Nick, who owns these ships?" "You don't need to know, Master Will." "I do." I was angry with him for being so cocky and so secretive. How could I trust him if he kept secrets from me? "I can go on my own," I said quietly. "I don't need you, Nicholas Drew." I had hurt him, I could see by his eyes. He nodded and turned away. "I'll go then." He looked at me. He started to walk away, his head held proudly high. "If you don't need me, I'll go." "Nick," I called, "tell me." He didn't turn his head. A few feet further on he stopped and stood, arms folded, looking down across the harbour to the open sea. Darkening now with the mystery as the sun was just tipping the last of itself under the shelf of the horizon. One day, I'm going to be a sailor like my father." I remembered him saying that to me, the day we went to Greenwich together. "I'm going to sail round the world and see everything there is to see." He was whistling again, a jaunty little jig that he used to fill up spaces between talking. It made me smile to hear it. I knew his head was filling up with adventures. I strolled over to him and stood by him. We still didn't look at each other. "I will go to France," I said. "I'll get there." "You might be seasick. Who'd look after you?" You might be seasick. Who'd look after you? We both started giggling. So tell me, Nick, who owns those ships? King Henry. What? He grinned at me, full of himself. Don't worry, he's not going on either of them. But there'll be plenty of courtiers on board, nobles and pages and lords and ladies in waiting and hundreds of soldiers. Just look at those ships. Doesn't it swell your heart to see them so fine and proud? They're like floating courts, I'm told. The Lion and the Sweepstake, they're called. I never saw anything more beautiful in my life. What are they doing here? I could see he was bursting to tell me now, but he teased me with a silence for a bit, till he couldn't hold it any longer. They're going to Calais along with 100 pretty little escort sailing ships to get the Princess Anne of Cleves and bring her to England. And when she gets to England, King Henry's going to marry her. That's what they told me down in the harbour. I could hardly believe what he was saying. King Henry was to take another wife? I spoke the names out loud. Queen Catherine of Aragon, Queen Anne Boleyn, Queen Jane Seymour, and now Queen Anne of Cleves. And what would happen to my little Prince Edward now if this new wife had sons too? All that the king cared about was having an heir to the throne. The prince was cosseted and cared for as if he was a weak sapling. Mother Jack had often said, his father wants him to grow into a mighty oak. It's to be hoped he does. I imagined the excitement and the gossip at court. I imagined the thrill the courtiers must feel at the thought of going to Calais to greet the future Queen of England. The Duke of Norfolk would probably be among them, and the Howard family. My Uncle Carew? Which of the ships would they be travelling on? You're never expecting me to go on one, with all those nobles, all those courtiers and soldiers. You're mad. But even greater than my fear of sailing on one of King Henry's ships was my terror of the sea itself. I moaned aloud in panic at the thought of floating across it, with the brown waves reaching up their arms to pull me down and down. Nick heard me. Master Will, it's more than that, isn't it? It's even more than being caught by the king's soldiers. You're real scared, even I can see that. Like there's ghosts around you. I could feel my throat burning and bruised with swallowing. I twisted Meg's amulet on my wrist. I had a brother, I said at last, and he drowned in the sea. And you saw it happen, most like. That's what scares you. I shook my head. No, I didn't see it happening. 1 minute we were standing on a rock together, and the next minute I was being pulled out of the sea by my father. He saved your life. But he thought I was Matthew. He wanted to save Matthew. Now it was coming, and I swallowed hard. I didn't want to cry. I didn't want to cry in front of Nick. What would he have done, your brother, if he was scared of the sea like you? He'd pretend he was a soldier going into battle. Onward, ever onward, that's what he used to say. I like that, Nick chuckled. He ran over to the fire I'd made and squatted down, turning the rabbit on its spit. The juices spurted into the flames, making them hiss, and he gave an ah of pleasure. I stood next to him. There was another thing nagging me like a sore tooth that needed to be jerked out. Nick, when you were getting washed at the tavern, I saw a ring under your tunic. He put his hand to his neck. I saw him clutching a cord. Can I see it? He dragged the cord over his head and thrust it at me. There. I've hid it as long as I could. It was my ring. The Montague ring. I could feel a kind of wild fury rising up in me. You had it all along. You stole it. It was you that night. Or you sent someone to take it off me, to beat me up. Sir, he kept trying to break in, but I was so angry and confused and upset that I didn't want to listen to him. I was like the little prince when he was having one of his tantrums. Nick said nothing at all until my anger had fizzled away. I was there that night. When you slipped away from me, I ran after you, tried to find you, and I saw that robber attacking you. I'd seen you looking at the ring when we were walking back from Greenwich, and I reckon he must have seen it too, and followed us till you were on your own. I pulled him off you, and when he ran off, I chased him instead of looking after you. I should have stayed, but I knew how much that ring meant to you. I kept swallowing, but I couldn't speak. I wasn't going to tell you about it, not yet. I chased after the man and I got the ring off him. I'm sorry to say I had to use my knife to do it, because he was bigger and stronger than me. I don't know what kind of state I left him in, and I don't really care. It was you I was worried about. I ran back and I couldn't find you. I was panicking, and when I did find you, I was grieved with myself for leaving you and chasing the robber instead. But why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you give me thy ring back? Sir, I didn't want anything like that ever to happen to you again because of this ring. I decided to keep my mouth shut, to wear the ring myself, and to give it to you when the time comes. That's what I decided, sir. and I believed him with all my heart. He was the one who had saved my life, my guardian angel. Do you want to wear it, or do you want me to keep it safe for you? Dumbly, I handed the ring back to him, and he looped it round his neck. I dare go on one of those ships, I said. I'll do it, if you'll come with me, Nick. I do need you. And then we tucked into that rabbit as if it were one of King Henry's famous banquets. It was the best feast ever. Onward, ever onward. There were deckhands everywhere on the harbour side, shouting orders, running, bustling, and we were told there would be no shortage of work for us to do, loading up little boats with boxes and barrels of stuff to be taken on board with the king's ships. It was bitterly cold down there by the sea. Little waves chopped round the harbour wall like dogs jumping up to snap at us. Get off to the line now, you boys, and help unload, a deckmaster shouted. Nick jumped lightly down into one of the little boats. I couldn't follow him. All my terror of the sea welled up again. The waves threw themselves up at me, ready to suck me down into themselves. Again and again they came for me, clawing at me with fingers of spray. I backed away, miserable with fear, and one of the sailors shoved me in the back. Get on, get on. I knew I had to make the hardest journey of my life, to take the step that had left the land behind me, and to trust myself to walk above the sea. My hands were sweaty with fright. I closed my eyes. Help me, Matthew, I whispered inside my head, and I heard a voice floating up to me. Onward, ever onward. I jumped and landed on all fours in the rocking little boat, and looked up to see Nick grinning at me. In no time we were out of the harbour and into the full swell of the waves. The nearer he drew to the king's ships, the huger they seemed, like timber castles rising out of the water. We could see the great blunt stern like a wall of wood, and the lines of cannons nosing out of the hull, and the slope of the Trumbull home, and the fancy balustrades and galleries. We could see the red and white flags of St. George already fluttering from the main masts, and the banners twitching from their two shorter masts. We could hear them flapping, even over the mutter of the waves and the screaming of the gulls. They reminded me of horses at the jousts, pawing the ground, eager to be off. I was as excited as Nick, too excited to be afraid any more, and I didn't need the snarling sailor behind me to urge me up the rope ladder at the deck of the Lion with a lash of rope. He made me yell out loud, but it was the excitement as much as with pain. A snail would do better. We've got a tide to catch, and it doesn't wait for the likes of you, he growled, and I levered myself out of the little boat and scrambled up the ladder, hand over fist. I had done it. I had really done it. I turned to see Nick grinning at me, and I knew I would never be afraid of the sea again. Boatload after boatload, the courtiers and their servants came, shuddering with cold in spite of their fancy fur cloaks, and after came the king's soldiers, boat after boat, till there were so many people crammed on board that if a fish had leapt up and landed on the deck, we'd have sunk. The tide was right, the sea was silver with morning light, our great ship, the Lion, was ready to sail. The little tugs rowed us out to sea. The men heaved on the ropes, and the sails were hoisted, with much flapping and straining, until they bellied out like huge birds' wings. The king's flags and banners were streaming wide now, bright as pheasants' tails. The ropes creaked, and all the timbers growled like snoring dogs. The little tugboats slipped their towing ropes and danced back towards the land. Our ship cut through the waves, and cold raining spray showered over us all. I ran to the side and looked across at the water at our sister ship, the Sweepstake. Her painted prow gleamed golden in the sun as she cut through the waves, her full sails billowed. Dozens of little painted barges sailed with us, surrounding us, blazing with colour and dancing on the waves. "Isn't that a grand sight?" Nick said behind me. "Like a charming flock of goldfinches. Even better, like angels they are, every one, and we must be in heaven." How King Henry would love to hear you saying that, I thought, seeing as he thinks he's God. But I daren't even whisper it out loud. My shoulders were still smarting from the sailor's rope. I didn't want to give anyone else an excuse to strike me again. I looked out at the boats skimming as if they were alive on the water, creatures of the sea. And suddenly, out of nowhere, the answer to one of Brother John's riddles came into my head. "Got it! Got it!" I shouted. "What?" "Tell me, Nick. I have no sight nor hands, many ribs, a mouth in my middle. I move on one foot. I am swift as the wind. What am I?" "What are you? You're a boy, same as me." He stared at me puzzled, and I wanted to laugh, but I held it back. "Course, you've got sight. You can see me, can't you?" "Get moving," a sailor shouted. There's some barrels here need lashing down. No time to admire the view. We've got 6 hours sailing ahead of us. It's the wind's kind. The wind wasn't kind. The wind was full of treachery that day, and soon after we left Dover and the gleaming white cliffs behind us, it tossed our boat about like a child's toy. But before it really took hold of us, before it threatened us with a cold swim, my day was spoiled by something far worse than wind or storm, thunder or lightning. Nick and I were scrabbling on our hands and knees on the deck. Some barrels were rolling loose, and he and I were the only ones small enough to scramble behind them to tighten the ropes again. A group of young courtiers strolled past us while we were crouching down there. All I could see from my tight corner were the legs, smart in coloured hose and fancy leather shoes. I could hear their voices. They were jesting together about the king's castle in France and how beautiful the women there were said to be. "I know for a fact that a pretty young goose called Marjorie has flown over there this year," one of them said. I started. They were talking about my sister. And then came another voice, one that I knew. "We could soon pluck her feathers." They laughed, and I went cold and sick inside. I ducked my head lower, and when they had passed, I turned slightly so I could look up. One of the courtiers was thinner and taller than the others. He was holding his cap in his hand so the wind wouldn't take charge of it. His flapping hair was the colour of candle wax. There was no doubt about it. It was Percy Howard. I sat back on my heels and groaned. "Will?" Nick asked. I couldn't put a voice to my anger and wretchedness. "Tell me," he insisted. "I've seen the person who put my father in prison, the Duke of Norfolk's nephew, Percy Howard. He came snooping round our hall and then he betrayed us to the king. And did you hear what he just said about my sister?" "I've got a knife," Nick whispered, "and I'll drive it between his shoulder blades." I knew he meant it, and part of me wanted to cheer him on too, to see the end of Percy Howard, who hated me so much. But I shook my head. "Kill Norfolk's nephew and in front of his friends? You're mad, Nick. You'd be thrown overboard, and so would I." Even so, my hand curled round the dagger at my belt. "And if he sees you here, what do you think he'll do to you? To you? He'll have you tied up and stored below till you can join your father. Let me do it now." "He'll never recognise me, surely," I said. "Not like this." I remembered the way I used to walk past the lower status people at the palace. They were nothing. I never looked them in the eye, unless they were among my servants. They had nothing to do with me. Someone like Percy Howard would never even notice a common ship's boy. He might know me by my red hair, but I had my cap pulled down down to cover it. The only thing he might recognise was my voice, just as I recognised his. If I kept quiet, he would never know me. It was better that way. Yet because of him I had lost my home and my father. It would mean nothing to him if King Henry's soldiers found me and threw me on the bonfire when we reached Calais. Why should I care what happened to him? Why should I spare his life when he had ruined mine? But I did care what happened to Nick. He would die. There was no doubt about it if he did anything to a member of the King's court. So I dropped my hand away and my dagger stayed where it was. I put my hand on Nick's arm and he let his own hand fall from his belt. And it was then that the wind turned. The sea became a foaming beast, lunging and rearing, slamming the lion from side to side, nearly tipping us overboard. Each time as we slid across the wet deck, and all those noblemen tricked out in their finery to greet the new queen were as sick as dogs. I saw Percy and his peacock flock of courtiers crawling to the side of the boat and clinging to the ropes. Their servants could do nothing to help them because they were in the same wretched state. Nick and I were too busy to be ill, and maybe we didn't have any rich food in our bellies to bring up. The immense sky was black and fierce. Day had turned into night. Green water streamed across the decks through the gun ports and washed this way, that way, whichever way the wind heaved the ship. The sailors hauled on the ropes and loosed the sails and tightened them again, and we were yelled at to give a hand. "For God's sake, or we'll be under water." Nick screamed with excitement through it all. A sailor, I'm a real sailor," he shouted. "God bless the wind and waves, God bless the sea." And just as suddenly as it had come, the storm dropped to a fine breeze and the wind blew us steadily on course again. The wretched courtiers lay slumped on the deck, their faces as white as codfishes. If I didn't despise Percy so much, I would have felt sorry for them. One of the young courtiers with him saw me looking and shouted over to me, "Boy, fetch me some ale and swill. My mouth tastes like stale cheese." His friends all laughed feebly. I called back that I didn't know where the ale was kept. "Don't speak to me like that, dog," the boy snapped. "Sir, I am not your servant," I said angrily and turned away. I regretted it instantly. It was too late. He was on his feet and feeling for his jewelled dagger, but Percy was there first. He grabbed me by the shoulders and swung me round and stared into my face. I tried to look down, but he cupped my chin in his hand and tilted my head back. "I know your voice," he said, "and I know your face, grubby as it is, and your hair like a mat of dirty red wool." He knocked my cap off and tugged me by the hair till my face was right against his. I shook my head, not daring to say anything else, and Nick slid up across the wet deck and tried to pull me away. "Leave him alone," he shouted. "If you know him, you know me too. We're brothers. Our father's a ferryman at Westminster Steps. We've rowed you across the Thames many a time, haven't we, Peter?" Percy stared at me, and then let me go, so I dropped back into Nick's arms. Then Percy staggered at a new turn in the wind, brought the boat up onto its elbows, and he launched himself back to the ship's side, groaning and clutching his stomach. "I wish I could die," he moaned. "Amen," whispered Nick in my ear. Strangers to each other. At last we drew into the port of Calais. "We've done it! We're in France!" Nick tugged excitedly at my sleeve. "We're proper sailors, we are!" The little cottages with their queer tiled roofs shambled in a higgledy-piggledy jumble up towards the king's mighty castle. Its pale towers and turrets looked slender and ghostly in the rainy mist. The long grey arms of the harbour stretched out to welcome us, and little boats danced towards us like streams of unleashed dogs running to greet their masters. Gunners fired cannons, and the shots echoed from all the walls of the town. The king's flags and banners fluttered like waving hands. Our anchor was lowered with a grumbling and groaning of chain and rope, and a mighty splash as it hit the water. An army of soldiers dressed in red and blue were the first to disembark, beating drums as they were rowed into the harbour. Next, the nobles and other highborn were taken ashore, and they had so much to be carried by the way of gifts and fine clothes, so much to be heaped into the waiting rowboats, and there was so much to do with ropes and sails, that nobody took any notice of us, scurrying backwards and forwards like ship's mice. At last all the nobles were landed and strolling off to their lodgings round the town and in the massive castle that dominated it. The Lion and the Sweepstake lay at ease outside the harbour, waiting for the future Queen of England to be brought on board. Nobody knew who we were. Nobody cared. Our captain was too busy to notice us. We jumped ashore with one of the boats and hauled the last 2 wooden chests that were bulging with gifts onto the waiting wheelbarrows. Then we looked at each other, looked back at our ship, and ran. We simply ducked our heads and scampered away, a pair of brown ship's mice lost among the crowd. Bells were pealing all round the little port, flags flying, trumpets blaring, cannons firing from the castle ramparts. Flocks of apprentices, merchants, women, with their little children, jostled together, waving coloured ribbons and shouting excitedly. It seemed as if all the people of Calais had come out that day to see King Henry's ships put in spite of all the chilly December rain squalling round their faces. I darted ahead of Nick, dodging between a group of apprentice boys dressed in the same brown woolen clothes as us. It was easy to mingle with them. Nick caught up with me at last, panting. "You've definitely learned how to run," he chuckled, gasping for breath. The street was slippery with so much rain and so many scurrying feet, and I slipped and fell a couple of times, smearing myself with mud. I didn't care. I could see the huge main gate to the castle now, and nothing was going to stop me. I sprinted through in the wake of a pushing crowd of Calais schoolboys, straight into a cobbled entrance yard. And there, at once, like a gift from my guardian angel, I saw my sister. I hardly recognised her at first. She was with a cluster of other girls, maids of honour, ladies-in-waiting, and young noblemen's wives. They were all giggling and talking excitedly, clutching one another's hands and laughing at private jokes. Marjorie looked taller than the last time I saw her, and not so plump and awkward. She was jumping up to see over a woman's head, and then she clutched another girl's hand and ran to be at the front of the group. I had never seen her looking so happy. I ran forward, waving my hand and shouting, "Marjorie, Marjorie," across the crowd. She turned her head this way and that, craning to see where the voice was coming from. She looked straight at me and away again. She didn't know me. I had changed as much as she had. We were strangers to each other. As I struggled to get nearer, a bearded nobleman came up to her and put a warm cloak round her shoulders, lifting up her hood to hide her face from the rain, and she stood on her toes and kissed him full on the lips, and pulled away, laughing up at him. I must be mistaken, I thought. This couldn't be my sister. This man couldn't be her ugly old husband. Crowds pressed between us, so I couldn't see them any more. I dodged round with Nick, following close behind me. When I got to the front, the girl had gone, along with all her friends, like a flock of birds. The man who had kissed her was still there, watching after them with a smile on his face. He turned to his waiting page and called, "Make sure Lady Marjorie changes into dry clothes." The boy bowed and hurried after my sister. "It must be him," I said to Nick. "I have to speak to him now." "I wouldn't, not yet," Nick warned, but I was so excited that I took no notice at all. "Give me the ring," I insisted. I pulled it from his neck and looped the cord over my head. "Be careful," he called. The man was already turning away. A flock of nuns passed in front of him, their brown habits flapping like cold sparrows. I pushed my way through them. I ran to him and put my hand on his arm. "Lord Richard of Carlisle?" I asked. He shook his arm in annoyance and frowned down at me. "There's a beggar's gate at the back of the castle," he said. "Go there for your scraps." "Lord Richard, please don't turn me away. I'm Marjorie's brother." He paused, looked briefly at me and raised his hand. Immediately 2 soldiers moved forward. One grasped me, pulling my hands behind my back. Nick ran out of the crowd and tried to pull me away and was immediately grabbed by the other soldier. They started hustling us away, and we squirmed and wriggled to break free. Lord Richard walked off as if he was turning his back on dogs fighting in the street. "I'm William!" I shouted desperately. "She must have talked to you about me. I come from Montague Hall. Marjorie is my sister. Please, please, let me speak to you." The soldier who was dragging me away flicked the back of his hand across my face. I shouted again, "Lord Richard, I am the son of Robert Montague." I struggled round and saw that Lord Richard had paused. He still had his back to me, but his head was turned to one side. He was listening. The soldier kicked me on, and in desperation I shouted it all again in French. He turned and looked at me. I said it again in Greek. It wasn't good Greek, I knew, but it was more than the ordinary ship's boy could do. He signalled to the soldier to let go, and I dropped to my knees. Nick stood with his hands on his hips, glaring defiantly at the soldiers. "Lord Richard, really and truly I am William Montague, grandson of Sir Henry Montague, brother of your wife, Marjorie." I said the whole thing and more, begging him to take me to my sister. I gave him her birth date. I told him she was afraid of dragons, that she wasn't a very good dancer, and I did it all in perfect Latin. Lord Richard smiled and came back to me. He touched my bowed head and told me to stand up. "How come a common boy like you is such a scholar?" "Because I am who I say I am, William Montague, the grandson of Sir Henry and son of Robert. My ancestor was Walter Montague." I pulled at the cord round my neck. "And this is my family's seal." Lord Richard took the ring from me and turned it over in his hand, curious and mystified. "Take no notice of him. He's a thief and a beggar." A voice came from behind me and I closed my eyes and sighed. I knew who it was, even before I turned to look at the pallid face of Lord Percy Howard. "He stole that ring. The person he pretends to be is wanted for treason," he laughed. "My advice to you is to throw this boy into a cell, along with his grubby friend, and let him rot." He strode up to Lord Richard, put an arm round his shoulders and walked him away, whispering to him intently. For a moment Lord Richard turned and looked at me, then he made a signal to the soldiers and walked on with Percy. The soldiers dragged Nick across the yard as if we were a bundle of rags, and I ran after him, begging him to leave them alone, not to hurt him. They opened a heavy studded door and threw him inside a room, and bowed mockingly to me. I followed, and they shut the huge studded door behind us. In the castle cell. "What did I tell you, Master Will?" Nick grumbled. He pulled his torn hose away from his knee, which was bleeding heavily where he had been dragged across the ground. "You do things too quick. You don't think first." "I had to do it," I said. "It was my only chance. Here." I kneeled down and tore a strip from my shirt and bandaged his knee with it. There was no window in the cell, and the only light to see by came from cracks around the hinges of the door. Nick watched me in surprise as I dabbed carefully at his knee, but he didn't say anything, and neither did I. And then I closed my eyes and sank back against the wall. It was all over now. After everything I had been through, if only Percy hadn't turned up at that minute. Everything was lost. I'd put us both in King Henry's hands, and there was no escaping now. Torture and death had been hanging over me for weeks and weeks. Thief, beggar, traitor. Was there anything else I could be accused of? And the worst thing was, I dragged Nick down with me. "Nick, I'm sorry." No one hated me more than Percy Howard, and he hated me for only one thing, because I was King Henry's favourite. He had despised me from the moment that King Henry had smiled at me and told me I had the look of himself. He had wanted me dead then. When he had his way now. Well, he had his way now. I put my head in my hands. I had dropped into a deep well, and there was no way out. I had no idea how long we sat there, saying nothing to each other. There was no more light in the room. It must have been well into the night when we heard footsteps, someone fumbling with the lock, and the door was pushed open. The light from a rush lantern flickered round our cell. We both leapt to our feet, alert, ready to run between the soldiers' arms if we could. but the light softened and spread, and we saw a small figure standing alone in the doorway. It was Marjorie. She held her lantern high and stared at me, her hand to her mouth. She stayed in the doorway, not stepping any further, with doubt and horror clouding her eyes. Yet there was a flicker of recognition there. "Marjorie," I said softly. "Will," she gasped, "it's really you. But you look so different. You're so grubby and your hair's matted like a wild cat's. And look at your bruises. What's happened to you?" Someone stepped in from the night and stood behind her, and as he held his lantern forward, I saw that it was Lord Richard. "You're quite sure?" he asked her. "I'm scared of the dragon," Marjorie whispered, moving towards me. "I'm scared of the bear," I said, and my sister flung her arms round me. "These are very strange times, and I had to protect you, Marjorie," Lord Richard said. "Percy is greedy and ambitious, like most young men in his family. But I didn't know he was so treacherous. He'll be punished for his lies. I'll have him sent on a mission straight away. He won't be back till long after you've gone, Will, I promise." "Let me get a room prepared for you," Marjorie said, "and a servant will bathe you and dress you in clean clothes. Then you can tell us all your news. Oh, Will, I can't believe it's you. Really and truly you. Here in Calais." "And what about this young fellow?" Lord Richard said, turning to Nick. "This is Nicholas Drew. I'm Master Will's servant, my lord," said Nick firmly. "I look after him, only I didn't do it too well this time." "Never mind, servant Nicholas. I'll put you with my own servants. You'll have a clean pallet by the fire, and you'll dine with them tonight in the great hall." "All my dreams come true all in one day!" Nick's eyes shone. "Wait till I tell Grandmum. But tomorrow, sir, I must go back to my ship. Master Will is safe now."